The fight often does not start with a huge betrayal. It starts with one person needing clarity and the other person hearing pressure. That is why anxious and avoidant relationships can explode so fast. The anxious person thinks, I am not asking for the world. I just need to know what this is, where I stand, why the energy changed, why you were warm yesterday and distant today. Why you keep coming close and then acting like closeness means nothing. The avoidant person hears something completely different. They hear demand. They hear expectation. They hear emotional responsibility. They hear, you are about to lose your freedom. You are about to disappoint someone. You are about to be trapped in a conversation where every answer has consequences. So one person reaches for clarity to calm fear, and the other person pulls away to calm fear. That is the control loop. Two people trying to feel safer, while each person's safety move scares the other one more. The anxious person asks because uncertainty feels unbearable. The avoidant person withdraws because being asked feels unbearable. The anxious person then feels abandoned and asks harder. The avoidant feels cornered and gets colder. Then the anxious person hears the coldness as proof that something is wrong, so they push for more truth. The avoidant hears the push as proof that closeness is dangerous, so they shut down even more. Nobody feels safe. Nobody feels understood. And suddenly, a simple need for clarity turns into a fight about tone, pressure, timing, space, sensitivity, and who ruined the moment. But underneath all of that, the real problem is this. The anxious person is trying to end uncertainty, and the avoidant person is trying to escape emotional demand. Those two survival strategies collide. That is why it explodes. Not because one person is crazy and the other person is innocent. Not because asking for clarity is wrong. Not because needing space is automatically cruel. It explodes because both nervous systems are trying to protect themselves from different threats at the exact same time. If this kind of clarity helps your nervous system settle, subscribe. PsychBond is a daily decoder for psychology, relationships, and avoidant and anxious attachment patterns, so you stop guessing. Now, let's make this very clear, because this is where people lose their minds. For the anxious side, clarity is not just information. Clarity is oxygen. When the connection feels uncertain, the body does not experience it as a small inconvenience. It feels like danger. Silence becomes a warning. A short reply becomes a signal. A shift in tone becomes evidence. A delay becomes a story. The anxious nervous system starts scanning for signs of loss because inconsistency does not feel neutral. It feels like the beginning of abandonment. So when an anxious person asks, "Where do we stand? Are we okay? What changed? Do you still want this? Are you pulling away?" They are often not trying to control the other person. They are trying to stop the internal free fall. They want one clean sentence that lets the body stop guessing. They want the fog to lift. They want the emotional floor back. But here is the brutal part. The way anxious people ask for clarity can sometimes make the avoidant nervous system feel exactly what it fears. The anxious person may ask with urgency, intensity, repeated wording, emotional heat, long explanations, or a tone that says, "If you do not answer me right now, I cannot breathe." That urgency is understandable, but to an avoidant person, it can sound like pressure, even when the need underneath is valid. They may not hear, "I am scared and I need steadiness." They hear, "You are responsible for fixing my fear." They hear, "Whatever you say will not be enough." They hear, "This conversation will swallow me." They hear, "If I engage, I will lose myself in someone else's emotions." So they move away. And the moment they move away, the anxious person's fear gets confirmed. That is how the loop tightens. The anxious person is not only asking the current question, they are asking every old question at once. Am I safe here? Am I wanted? Am I about to be left? Did I misread the warmth? Am I too much? Are they going to disappear? The avoidant person is not only reacting to the current sentence either. They are reacting to every old experience where closeness came with pressure, guilt, control, criticism, or emotional demand. So both people are in the present conversation, but their bodies are fighting old battles. This is why the argument can feel bigger than the issue. The issue might be a delayed text, a canceled plan, a vague answer, a weird change in energy. But the emotional charge underneath is much older. For the anxious person, uncertainty can feel like being emotionally dropped. For the avoidant person, being questioned can feel like being emotionally trapped. So when clarity meets pressure, the explosion is usually not about the words alone. It is about what the words represent to each nervous system. The anxious person thinks clarity means safety. The avoidant person thinks clarity means a loss of space. The anxious person thinks, if you care, answering should be easy. The avoidant thinks, if you trusted me, you would not need to ask like this. The anxious person thinks, your silence is hurting me. The avoidant thinks, your intensity is overwhelming me. And both people feel unseen. This is why anxious-avoidant fights often turn into arguments about the argument. The original topic disappears. Suddenly, it is not about the relationship anymore. It is about how the anxious person asked. It is about how the avoidant person responded. It is about whether the question was fair. It is about whether the timing was bad. It is about whether someone is being too sensitive or too cold. This is how the real issue gets buried. The anxious person wanted a clear answer. The avoidant person wanted less pressure. But because neither person could name the fear underneath, the conversation becomes a battlefield. One side says, I just need clarity. The other side says, I need space. One side hears space as rejection. The other side hears clarity as control. Then both sides start defending against the other person's defense. That is the control loop. Your protection activates their protection. Their protection activates your protection. Nobody is reaching the actual wound because everyone is busy surviving the reaction. Avoidants often experience direct emotional questions as heavier than they sound to everyone else. This is why an anxious person can feel shocked by the avoidant reaction. You may think, I asked one normal thing. Why are they acting like I cornered them? Why does everything become pressure? Why is clarity treated like an attack? But to an avoidant system, clarity often carries hidden consequences. If they answer, they may have to commit. If they commit, they may have to be consistent. If they are consistent, someone may depend on them. If someone depends on them, they may fail. If they fail, they may become the bad person. So instead of hearing one question, their body hears a whole chain of future obligation. This is not always conscious. They may just feel irritated, heavy, numb, defensive, or suddenly desperate for space. They may not be able to say, I'm scared that answering you will create expectations I do not know how to carry. They may say, why are you making this such a big deal? They may say, I cannot do this right now. They may say, you are stressing me out. They may say, I feel pressured. They may say nothing. and disappear into silence. This is why avoidant distance can feel so punishing. It often arrives right when the anxious person is most scared. But from the avoidant side, the distance feels like oxygen. That is the cruel mirror. The anxious person feels calmer when the avoidant moves closer. The avoidant feels calmer when the emotional demand moves farther away. So the same action that regulates one person dysregulates the other. Closeness calms one nervous system and alarms the other. Distance calms one nervous system and alarms the other. That is why this pairing can feel addictive and impossible at the same time. Each person's relief can become the other person's wound. The anxious person's relief comes from contact, reassurance, conversation, and repair. The avoidant person's relief often comes from quiet, space, time, and less emotional intensity. Neither need is evil on its own. The problem is when the anxious person uses contact as emergency medicine, and the avoidant person uses distance as emotional escape. Then, both strategies become extreme. The anxious person does not just ask once, they ask again, explain again, clarify again, send another message, rephrase the need, try to soften it, then panic when the answer is cold. The avoidant person does not just take a respectful pause, they go vague, delay, minimize, disappear, act annoyed, or return later as if nothing happened. That is where the loop becomes damaging. Not because clarity is bad, not because space is bad. Because clarity becomes pursuit, and space becomes avoidance. Once that happens, the relationship stops feeling like two adults talking and starts feeling like a chase scene. One person moves toward the conversation because they cannot rest without answers. The other moves away from the conversation because they cannot breathe inside the emotional demand. And the more one moves, the more the other reacts. This is why anxious people often feel like they become someone they do not recognize. They may start calm, but after enough avoidance, they become intense. They send messages they regret. They ask the same question in 10 forms. They say they are done, then ask for one more answer. They try to sound secure, then the panic leaks through anyway. They feel embarrassed later because they know the delivery became too much, but they also know the pain was real. The avoidant also may become someone they do not respect. They may stonewall, deflect, act cold, become dismissive, or make the anxious person feel needy for wanting basic clarity. Later, they may feel guilty, but in the moment, distance feels like survival. This is why the explosion is not random. It is predictable when uncertainty and pressure keep feeding each other. The anxious person needs the ambiguity to end. The avoidant person needs the intensity to end. The anxious person tries to end ambiguity by asking more. The avoidant tries to end intensity by withdrawing more. But asking more increases intensity, and withdrawing more increases ambiguity. So both people are using a strategy that gives the other person more of what hurts them. That is the core loop. The anxious strategy creates more pressure. The avoidant strategy creates more uncertainty. Pressure makes the avoidant retreat. Uncertainty makes the anxious pursue. Then, both people feel justified. The anxious person says, "I would not be this intense if you were not so unclear." The avoidant says, "I would not be this distant if you were not so intense." Both statements may contain truth, but if both people stay inside those defenses, nothing changes. They only keep proving each other's fear. The anxious person proves to the avoidant that closeness becomes demand. The avoidant proves to the anxious person that love becomes abandonment. That is why the relationship can feel like it has good moments, but no stable ground. When things are calm, both people may believe the worst is over. The avoidant feels relaxed because nobody is asking for anything. The anxious person feels hopeful because the warmth is back. But if the underlying loop has not changed, the calm is fragile. The next ambiguous moment wakes the anxious fear. The next urgent question wakes the avoidant fear. And the same explosion returns, wearing a slightly different outfit. This is why people can have the same fight for months or years. It is not really the same fight. It is the same nervous system loop using different topics. Texting, plans, labels, commitment, tone, social media, silence, a change in energy, a canceled date, a vague response. The topic changes, but the loop stays. One person says, "Show me I am safe." The other says, "Stop making me feel trapped." One person wants words. The other wants room. One person wants repair now. The other wants time to calm down. One person feels abandoned by the pause. The other feels invaded by the urgency. And because both feelings are intense, both people start treating their feeling as the whole truth. This is where the relationship loses reality. The anxious person may decide if they need space, they do not care. The avoidant may decide if they need clarity, they are trying to control me. Both can be wrong. Needing space does not always mean not caring. Needing clarity does not always mean controlling. But in the loop, both nervous systems become suspicious. They stop interpreting each other with generosity. Every move becomes evidence. The anxious person sees distance and thinks, they are leaving. The avoidant sees urgency and thinks, I am being swallowed. That is why a normal sentence can land like a threat. It is passing through a frightened nervous system before it reaches the heart. Control loop analysis matters because it shows you the pattern without making only one person the villain. But let's be very clear. Understanding both sides does not mean both behaviors cause the same damage. Repeated withdrawal, silence, vagueness, and emotional denial can seriously destabilize someone. Repeated pursuit, interrogation, emotional flooding, and panic texting can also wear the other person down. The point is not to excuse either side. The point is to understand why the explosion happens, so you stop believing every fight is only about the visible topic. The visible topic is usually just the match. The gasoline is the loop. And the loop is made of two fears: fear of abandonment and fear of engulfment. The anxious person fears being left emotionally alone. The avoidant fears being consumed by someone else's needs. When those fears meet, clarity starts sounding like pressure, and pressure starts creating more distance. Then distance creates more panic, and panic creates more pressure. That is why the loop feels so hard to stop. Each person's behavior seems logical from inside their own fear. If you are anxious, asking more feels logical because silence is unbearable. If you are avoidant, pulling away feels logical because the emotional intensity feels unbearable. The problem is that fear-based logic usually protects the individual in the short term and damages the relationship in the long term. The anxious person may get a temporary answer, but the avoidant becomes more guarded. The avoidant may get temporary peace, but the anxious person becomes more activated. Nobody gets real safety. They only get temporary relief. And temporary relief is one of the reasons this pattern becomes addictive. After the explosion, there may be a reunion. The avoidant returns softer. The anxious person calms down. There may be affection, apology, or a good conversation. For a while, the bond feels alive again. The anxious person thinks, "Finally, we understand each other." The avoidant thinks, "Good, the pressure is gone." But if the real loop is not addressed, that reunion becomes another reset, not a repair. A reset means the emotional weather improves, but the pattern remains untouched. Repair means both people understand what happened and change what happens next. A reset says, "Let's feel better." Repair says, "Let's stop repeating this." Anxious avoidant couples often get trapped in resets because the relief after conflict feels like progress. The anxious person is so grateful the distance ended that they may avoid bringing up the deeper issue. The avoidant is so relieved the intensity stopped that they may avoid naming their part. So the relationship returns to calm without building a new way to handle fear. Then the next trigger arrives, and the old loop takes over again. This is why clarity can feel like pressure, even when the anxious person asks gently. If the relationship has history, one question carries the weight of every previous explosion. The avoidant may hear the old fight inside the new sentence. The anxious person may hear the old abandonment inside the new pause. That history makes both people react faster. It takes less to trigger more. A small delay can bring up the memory of being ignored for days. A simple question can bring up the memory of a 3-hour emotional conversation. So the relationship becomes sensitive to itself. The pattern has trained both bodies to expect danger. That is why the first few seconds of a conversation matter so much. Not because you need perfect wording. Perfect wording will not save a bond where both people refuse awareness. But the opening matters because it tells the nervous system what kind of room this is. Is this a courtroom, a chase, a trap, a shutdown, or a conversation? The anxious person often opens with too much fear. The avoidant often opens with too much defense. Then, both people respond to the energy before they respond to the content. The anxious person may say, "I just want to understand." But the energy says, "I am terrified, and you need to fix it." The avoidant may say, "I need space." But the energy says, "Your feelings are too much, and I am leaving the room emotionally." That is why both people feel hurt by things that were not fully said. The body hears the hidden message. The anxious person hears, "You are alone." The avoidant hears, "You are trapped." One reason this loop explodes so hard is because both sides often want the other person to regulate first. The anxious person thinks, "If you reassure me, I will calm down." The avoidant thinks, "If you calm down, I will reassure you." So both wait for the other to become safe before they offer safety. That waiting becomes a standoff. The anxious person keeps escalating because reassurance is not coming. The avoidant keeps withholding because escalation is happening. This is where the relationship can become cruel without either person planning cruelty. The anxious person may use emotional urgency to force connection. The avoidant may use distance to force silence. Both are control moves. They do not feel like control from the inside, they feel like survival. But they are still attempts to make the other nervous system change so your own can calm down. That is why this episode title had to be blunt. Why do avoidants explode when anxious people ask for clarity? Because clarity is not heard as clarity inside the loop. It is heard as pressure by the avoidant. And distance is not heard as space by the anxious. It is heard as abandonment. Once those meanings take over, the conversation is no longer about what was said. It is about what each body believes is about to happen. The anxious body believes love is about to disappear. The avoidant body believes freedom is about to disappear. Both react to disappearance. One chases, one hides. The chase makes the hiding worse. The hiding makes the chase worse. This is the engine. This is why the same two people can love each other, miss each other, even have real tenderness, and still keep hurting each other in the exact place they are trying to be loved. Love does not automatically fix a nervous system loop. Chemistry does not fix it. Missing each other does not fix it. A long conversation does not fix it, if both people only talk until the panic goes down. The loop changes only when both people can recognize the moment their protection starts becoming the other person's wound. The anxious person has to see when clarity seeking turns into pressure that no answer can satisfy. The avoidant person has to see when space seeking turns into abandonment that leaves the other person emotionally bleeding. Without that awareness, both people keep calling their defense a need, and the other person's need a threat. That is the sentence to remember. Inside the loop, my defense feels reasonable, and your need feels dangerous. That is how people who care about each other become enemies in the same conversation. The practical part is small, because the real soothing here is understanding the mechanism. But the practical truth is this: the explosion usually slows down only when clarity and space stop being used as weapons. Clarity has to become clean, not frantic. Space has to become named, not disappearing. A clean clarity ask sounds like, "I noticed the shift, and I need to know where you stand." It does not become 10 messages, accusations, and emotional cross-examination. Named space sounds like, "I am overwhelmed and need a pause, but I am not disappearing. I will come back to this conversation." It does not become silence, vagueness, or punishment. If both people cannot do that, the loop will keep choosing for them. The anxious person will call it clarity, while the avoidant feels pressure. The avoidant will call it space, while the anxious feels abandoned. Then both will wonder why something that started with a simple question became another emotional fire. The answer is because the question entered a loop that was already loaded. The clarity was not the problem by itself. The pressure was not only in the words. The explosion came from the meaning each nervous system attached to the moment. One person was trying to stop abandonment. The other was trying to stop engulfment. And until that is named, the same fight keeps coming back. So if you are anxious, the hard truth is that asking more will not create safety with someone who uses distance to regulate. And if you are avoidant, the hard truth is that pulling away will not create peace with someone whose body reads silence as danger. Both people may get short relief, but the relationship pays for it. The real question is not, who is more wrong in this one argument? The real question is, can this connection hold clarity without turning it into pressure? And can it hold space without turning it into abandonment? Because if it cannot, the bond may have feelings, chemistry, longing, and history, but it will not have enough emotional ground to stop exploding. Welcome to PsychBond. You're safe here.